The Friday sun hung high in the sky as Brian Hayes parked his car across the street from the precinct. He adjusted his shirt collar, smoothing out imaginary creases, and stared at the building before him. Precinct 34. It was going to be his station, the one he'd be running as the new supervisor starting Monday. But today was about observation, about seeing the place without the weight of authority hanging around his neck. No badge, no uniform, no formalities. Just Brian the man blending in. He took a deep breath, crossed the street, and stepped through the precinct doors. The air inside was colder than he expected, carrying the faint smell of coffee, old paper, and industrial cleaner. Officers moved around briskly, laughing and chatting in groups. Brian stood there for a moment, his dark brown skin stark against the sea of pale faces around him. No one seemed to notice him at first. Until they did. A middle-aged officer with a salt and pepper mustache looked up from his desk and narrowed his eyes at Brian. His voice rang out, loud enough to silence the hum of conversation. "Hey, you lost, buddy," the man barked. A few heads turned, eyes scrutinizing Brian like he didn't belong. "I'm just here to," Brian started, but before he could finish, the officer cut him off. "This ain't a public tour," he said, standing up and walking toward Brian. "We don't have time for visitors. You need to leave. I'm just getting a feel for the station." "Getting a feel?" Another officer chimed in from across the room, laughing. "We don't do sightseeing here. Get out before we make you." Brian raised his hands in a calm gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble." A few of them were laughing now. The salt and pepper officer stepped closer, his jaw tight. Brian could feel the tension in the room shift. It wasn't just annoyance, it was disdain, the kind that sank into your bones. "Look, I'm not leaving," Brian said firmly. Before he could finish, someone grabbed his arm roughly from behind. Another officer appeared at his side, his grip firm, eyes blazing with contempt. "Didn't you hear him? You don't belong here," the officer spat. Literally. Brian flinched as a glob of spit landed on his shirt. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper would only make things worse. "What's the matter?" the first officer sneered. "You deaf or just dumb?" The shove came next, hard and deliberate, sending Brian stumbling backward toward the door. A ripple of laughter erupted from the group, a toxic camaraderie, built on cruelty. Brian straightened his posture, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with quiet fury. "Remember this moment," he said softly, his voice steady. The officers just laughed harder, unaware of the storm they just invited into their lives. By 8 a.m., the precinct was alive with its usual buzz. Officers gathered around desks, chatting about weekend plans and half-heartedly flipping through paperwork. The mood was casual, almost lazy, until the station's intercom crackled to life. "All personnel to the briefing room immediately." The announcement was sharp, authoritative, and unfamiliar. A ripple of confusion swept through the station as officers shuffled toward the room, muttering to one another. "What's this about? Maybe the new supervisor's here." "Doubt it. I heard he's not coming until next week." As they filed into the briefing room, they froze. Standing at the front, in full uniform, was Brian Hayes. His gold badge gleamed on his chest, and his expression was calm, yet commanding. The salt and pepper officer from Friday stopped dead in his tracks, his face draining of color. "Good morning," Brian said, his voice even and unyielding. "I'm Brian Hayes, your new supervisor." The room was silent, a thick, suffocating silence that hung heavy in the air. Brian's eyes swept across the crowd, landing on familiar faces, the ones who had shoved him, spat on him, laughed at him. Those faces were pale now, their confidence shattered. "Before we get started," Brian continued, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade, "I'd like to address something that happened here on Friday." A few officers exchanged nervous glances, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. Brian walked toward the front row, his boots echoing against the tiled floor. "On Friday, he said, his voice sharp. "I came here to observe the station. To see how you worked, how you interacted with the community you're supposed to serve. And what I saw was racism. Pure, ugly racism." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. "You assumed I was an intruder. You roughed me up. You spat on me. And you shoved me out of this station, without knowing who I was or why I was here. Let me make one thing clear. That kind of behavior has no place in this precinct, or anywhere in this city." A murmur rippled through the crowd, officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Brian held up a hand, silencing them. "I've reviewed the security footage," he said. "I know exactly who was involved. And as of this morning, several of you are being suspended without pay. The rest of you will be reassigned to community duties for the next month." He gestured to the back of the room, where a pile of bright orange vests sat. Each vest bore the words, "This is what racism does to you," in bold black letters. "You'll be wearing those," Brian said, his tone firm. "And you'll be out on the streets, cleaning up parks, picking up trash, and explaining to the public why you're there. Maybe then you'll understand the weight of your actions." The room was silent again, the officers too stunned to speak. Brian let the moment stretch, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Being a police officer is an honor," he said finally, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "We are here to protect and serve. That means everyone, not just the people who look like you. If you can't uphold that standard, you have no business wearing this badge." With that, Brian turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned and chastened group of officers. Outside, the sun was shining, the air crisp with the promise of change. For Brian Hayes, it was just the beginning. But he knew one thing for certain: this station would never be the same again. The following days at Precinct 34 were unlike anything the officers had ever experienced. The sight of their peers, forced to wear the bright orange vests with the bold words, "This is what racism does to you," was a stark reminder of their actions. Officers shuffled in and out of the precinct with their heads low, avoiding the eyes of community members who watched them with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction as they picked up litter, scrubbed graffiti, and swept sidewalks. Brian Hayes wasn't one to revel in anyone's humiliation. This wasn't about revenge, it was about transformation. If this station was going to become a place of fairness and justice, then it had to start with accountability. On Wednesday morning, Brian called a mandatory meeting. The officers filed into the briefing room, subdued, their usual bravado replaced by a quiet tension. The air felt heavy as Brian stood at the front, arms crossed, his steady gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm sure you've all had some time to reflect," Brian began, his voice calm but firm. "But reflection alone isn't enough. We need to talk about what happened, why it happened, and how we're going to make sure it never happens again." The room was silent. Some officers avoided his gaze, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, one of them spoke. It was Officer Reed, the man with the salt and pepper mustache who had been the first to confront Brian that Friday. "Sir," Reed began hesitantly, his voice low. I want to apologize to you. What we did, was wrong. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I disrespected not just you, but the badge I wear." Brian nodded, but his face remained unreadable. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Reed. But it's not enough to say you're sorry. I need to know that you understand why what you did was wrong." Reed hesitated, his cheeks reddening. "Because I judged you," he admitted finally. "Because of how you looked. I saw a black man walk into the station, and instead of treating you with respect, I treated you like a criminal. I was wrong." The room was still, the weight of Reed's words hanging in the air. Brian let the silence stretch before he spoke. "Thank you for your honesty," Brian said. "What you just admitted takes courage. But it shouldn't take a public shaming or disciplinary action for you, or anyone else in this room, to see the humanity in another person. As police officers, we are entrusted with an incredible responsibility. We are supposed to uphold justice, not perpetuate prejudice." He let his words sink in, his voice carrying the gravity of his message. If we can't hold ourselves to that standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? How can we expect to be effective at our jobs? A young officer near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir," she said, her voice soft. "I wasn't involved in what happened on Friday, but I didn't do anything to stop it, either. Just watched. And that makes me complicit, doesn't it?" Brian turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, it does," he said simply. "But recognizing that is the first step toward doing better. Next time you see something wrong, whether it's inside these walls or out on the streets, I expect you to speak up. Silence is a choice. And inaction is just as harmful as the act itself." As the days turned into weeks, Brian made it his mission to rebuild the station from the ground up. He implemented regular bias training sessions, bringing in speakers from the community to share their experiences with discrimination, experiences that many of the officers had never considered. He also created a mentorship program, pairing seasoned officers with younger recruits to foster a culture of respect and learning. But perhaps most importantly, Brian made himself approachable. He didn't just lead from his office. He led from the ground, joining officers on patrols, attending community meetings, and engaging with the very people they were sworn to protect. At first, the changes were met with resistance. Some officers grumbled about the extra training sessions, while others quietly questioned whether Brian's approach would make a difference. But over time, the culture began to shift. Officers started to listen, truly listen, to the stories of those they had once dismissed. They began to see the community not as a collection of potential threats, but as people with hopes, fears, and dreams. 3 months after Marcus's first day, a community event was held at the precinct. It was a barbecue organized by the station to build trust and strengthen ties with the neighborhood. Marcus watched as officers mingled with residents, laughing, sharing stories, and for the first time in a long time, feeling like part of the community rather than separate from it. As Marcus stood by the grill, flipping burgers, Officer Reed approached him. The older man looked nervous, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Sir," Reed began, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to thank you for not giving up on us." "On me?" Marcus looked at him, his expression softening. "You've come a long way, Reed. But the real thanks go to the community. They're the ones who've been willing to give us another chance." Reed nodded, his eyes misting slightly. "I'll admit, when you first walked in here, I thought you were just another supervisor passing through. But you've changed this place. You've changed me. And I'll never forget that." Marcus smiled, clapping Reed on the shoulder. "Good, because the work's not done yet. It never is." In the months and years that followed, Precinct 34 became a model for other stations in the city. The lessons learned under Marcus's leadership rippled outward, inspiring other officers to confront their biases and build stronger connections with their communities. And for Marcus Hayes, every challenge, every difficult conversation, and every hard-fought victory was a reminder of why he had taken the badge in the first place: to serve, to protect, and to make a difference. Because justice wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about changing hearts and minds.